Hi everyone, I wanted to welcome you to this webinar. We're going to talk about the myth of learning styles. I am Dr. Sean Nufer, and if you have any questions throughout this presentation, go ahead and enter them in the questions box, or you can contribute in the chat as well. I'm going to talk about a few different concepts. I'm going to talk about learning styles and um, how they are ineffective and some alternatives to both learning and teaching education. So with that, I'll get started. Let me click here. As we talk about teaching and learning, this will look very familiar to anybody who is in psychology or education. I know we have various people on the call here, but when we're talking about learning, what we're talking about is acquiring information and retaining that information, being able to retrieve it when we need it. And so we talk about various stages of the learning process. Here we have attention, encoding, storage, retrieval. Attention refers to the fact that there's a lot of stimulus in the world. There are a lot of stimuli everywhere. We have lights and sounds. We have basic senses. Everybody knows the five basic senses. We have sight, smell, taste, hear, touch. We really have a lot more senses than that. We have a lot of information in the world and a lot of ways that we acquire that information. And we have um, a lot more than just five senses. For example, we're also sensitive to heat versus cold, which would be thermoception. We know if we're falling or if we're off balance or if we're accelerating or decelerating, which is a sense called equilibrioception. Nociception would be being sensitive to pain. For example, pain being different than touch, having different receptors and registering in different places in the brain. Proprioception would be knowing our body in relation to each other. If you were to close your eyes and extend your arm and touch your nose without looking, that's because you know where your arm is in space and time and where your fingers are. We can pay attention to different parts of our body. And people who suffer injuries, such as amputations, sometimes they still have that proprioception, that sense that they have that limb and they can almost sense that limb. And so there's a lot of information in the world that's wanting our attention, but our brains are sensitive to what attention we provide to the various stimulus. There's also factors such as hedonistic adaptation. Likely, you are all wearing socks. The last time you thought about the fact that you were wearing socks before I mentioned it was probably early this morning when you were putting your socks on, and then you forget about it for the rest of the day, even though you're in contact with those socks constantly. Assuming you're not in Hawaii or I'm in Florida, I happen to not be wearing socks at the moment because we go with flip flops a lot, but there are a lot of senses, such as there might be a humming of light, there might be a plane flying overhead, there might be cars driving outside the window where you are, or shuffling of papers, depending, and a lot of stuff we don't pay attention to. So when it comes to learning, we need to pay attention to something and we need to process it through this encoding process. It needs to be stored in our brain and then it needs to be retrieved when we need it. In this sense, our brains are similar to computers. You've probably heard this analogy many times. We have attention. The computers have attention spans, a working memory. When you type on the keyboard, it makes a note. By the way, he just typed the letter P and he hit an enter. It remembers that for a brief second, not even just a fraction of a second, really, and then it forgets it because it doesn't need to know that. As opposed to if you're typing a line of code or programming that the computer is going to refer to, then that will be stored. An application on your computer would be stored, or a program, like a Word document. You type up a Word document, you hit save, and it's stored. It doesn't need to be up on your monitor all the time, but when you need it, then you have access to retrieve that. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about learning and teaching, the ability to retain information, to store it and retain it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about learning styles here. You're probably very familiar with the concept of learning styles. It's formally called the meshing hypothesis. I have a link before I get started here. This is bit.ly/1i big Q 0 OVJ. And this is a journal article that was published by the American Psychological Society, and I'm going to refer to that in a moment. But psychologists were tasked with looking at all the research available on learning styles and doing a meta-analysis, meaning um, looking at everything and seeing, okay, what does the community tell us? What does the scientific community tell us about the validity of these things? So when you're talking about learning styles, you've probably heard many times over the course of your life, some people are visual learners, that they learn best by seeing something, seeing it in action. Other people learn best by hearing or reading, or some people are kinesthetic learners. They need to be doing something in order to learn a concept. They need to be working with their hands. Other people are interpersonal, have an interpersonal learning style or an intrapersonal learning style. And the key behind the meshing hypothesis is to be able to identify those preferences for learning and then to be able to cater the lesson, the content to best accommodate those preferences for the learners. It's a personalized learning, which is very popular right now, and it always has been. The thing about the meshing hypothesis is that it is not a valid, it's not valid in the field of education. There's no scientific evidence really to support it, and there's a lot of evidence that says learning styles are not an effective use of resources, and they're not an effective way to learn or to teach material. And so I know everybody's muted, but I think I heard a few gasps there saying that, because this, for many years, for decades even, this has been known as the holy grail of sorts of education. Finally, we found a way that we can personalize learning and that we can optimize, the acquisition of knowledge and the retention of knowledge. But we're finding we just go in circles. There's no evidence to support this at all. So I'm going to talk about, what does the research look like? How do we know that learning styles don't exist, that they're not valid? So those psychologists from the APS, when they went out to do their meta-analysis, they had a strict list of criteria for what constitutes good methodology. So they looked at dozens, maybe hundreds of studies. And so I'm going to paint a picture of what some of those studies might look like. Suppose we have learners, and we break them into 3 different groups for this example, and we are testing them on their acquisition of a list of items. So one group receives this list through writing and reading. The list here: house, desk, chocolate, backpack, and such. And then they're tested. They usually read the list, study it, rehearse it, and then engage in a different activity, then come back and they're assessed on how much they retain from that. Another group received that same list, but through imagery. So they saw pictures of houses and desks and alligators and pants. And a third group, and each of these groups have various learning preferences, learning styles among the learners. A third group would receive that same list spoken to them through auditory channels. And so what we find is we have 3 groups: a word group, a picture group, and an audio group. And what the research time and time indicates is that there's no statistically significant variance between the various learning styles, regardless of what group people are placed in. But it would come to think that for this group here, the auditory learners, if there are auditory learners in this auditory modality, then they should do better than everybody else who is not an auditory learner. But we found that that isn't true. And likewise, auditory learners didn't do any more poorly on students who were visual learners and were in the visual group. Another example of how you could do this study is you have a story and students have to read the story for comprehension. Half of the participants, half of the learners in this group are from various different learning styles, but not reading. So maybe kinesthetic or visual. And then half of the other 50% are specifically catered to this learning preference for reading. And then you test them, and you do the same thing with another modality, such as video, multimedia, where half of the students are multimedia learners, the other half are not. And we find that there really is no difference within each group, whether the student has that preference or not, or whether they identify with a different preference. And so the APS concluded in their meta-analysis that in order for learning styles to be a valid theory, then students must perform best when they're paired with their learning preference, the modality being taught. And likewise, students must, when they are paired with their preference, students must perform better than other students who have a different learning style. What we found is that none of that is really true. You might have seen graphs like this, maybe not exactly like this, but things such as you only remember 10% of things that you read. If you see it, then you remember more. Seeing and hearing is 50%, actually doing it is 80%. The problem is that there's no science behind this either. This graph actually came from a journal, and you can even look up this resource, this citation right here, but you're not going to find primary research supporting that. And I'll mention as a side note, anybody who's actually done research knows that things don't fall cleanly into categories of 10%, 20%, 30, 50. Life isn't that organized, and life isn't good like that. But you can dig as deep as you want, but you're never going to find primary research with good methodology that supports any of these claims. You might go back, the earliest, as I've dug around, the earliest that I've seen is this cone right here. This comes from a 1969 publication. A researcher. Now, Dale published this in a journal. He also published several journal articles and even wrote a book or two around that era. It wasn't primary research necessary. It was more speculation, and this was the precursor to what we know as learning theories and the meshing hypothesis, that perhaps there are different ways that you can form experiences for better retention. And I apologize for the graininess of this image right here. It was an old publication. You might be able to find a more sharp one somewhere on the internet. But the gist is that most of the research that supports learning styles, it's not primary research, and it goes back and back, and eventually it goes back to this research by Dale in 1969, who wasn't actually doing research and studying this empirically. Yet we tend to think that there's empirical evidence for learning styles. I'm going to go back to that journal article. A statement they made there. I know it's bad form, but I'm just going to read this for us. Very few studies have even used an experimental methodology capable of testing the validity of learning styles applied to education. Moreover, of those that did use an appropriate method, several found results that flatly contradict the popular meshing hypothesis. Meshing hypothesis being this notion of learning styles. So there is no valid empirical support, and there's a lot of support. There are a lot of articles saying, no, this actually isn't. It isn't a valid form of teaching or learning. And it can be dangerous because we invest a lot of resources and time and energy into finding ideal ways to present information so that we can reach our learners. And so now that we know learning styles are not effective, then maybe we can allocate those resources to other endeavors. And I don't entirely want to abandon this concept of learning styles, but I want to reframe it a little bit. Instead of talking about how can we address students' preference, let's take that, and instead of students, let's replace that with the content. How can we best present this content in a way that the content really should be presented? And so I have a slide here for teaching styles, which I don't think I made it up, but I don't know that that's a real thing, but I'll explain. So the first thing here, golf. Let's suppose my son wants to take up golf, and he wants me to be his teacher and teach him how to play golf. Now, his first mistake is that he's asking me to teach him to play golf. But let's assume in this scenario that I know golf, that I'm a scratch golfer, that I'm capable of playing golf and teaching golf, which is a myth in itself. But so I have this task. Somebody wants me to teach him golf. What's the best way to teach him golf? Suppose my son, in a traditional sense, he is an auditory learner. And I say, okay, well, if you're an auditory learner, should I give you an audiobook to listen to play golf, or maybe I could download him a bunch of podcasts and he can learn golf by listening to podcasts, or I can orate at him, I can lecture him on the components of golf. I mean, that's pretty silly. I wouldn't do that. If he's a visual learner, I wouldn't show him video clips. I wouldn't, if he's a linguistic learner, I wouldn't buy him a book and a subscription to Golf Digest or anything. Now, the best way to teach him golf, it doesn't matter his learning style. The best way to teach him would be to take him out there. I might explain a few things. I might show him, demonstrate how to swing a club. and then I'll put a club in his hand, have him swing it a couple times, and give him instant feedback right there. And I'll critique him. Maybe I'll show him again how to swing, and I'll have him take some practice. So it doesn't matter if he's not a kinesthetic learner. He needs to learn this kinesthetically. He needs to have a club in his hand. He needs to be hitting a golf ball, and that's how I'm going to teach him. It doesn't matter the learning style. What I'm concentrating on is the teaching style. I'm supporting the curriculum and presenting it in an ideal way. So another example, let's suppose I am teaching about different types of birds, and I want to teach about their sizes, the colors, the patterns of the feathers, wingspans, things like that. I wouldn't have that content and think, okay, well, this person's an auditory learner, so I'm going to record my lecture and he can listen to it in MP3 format on his way to school and on the bus or on the train or something. Or I'm not going to, if I write a book about this, I mean, there are obviously books about birds, I'm going to include lots of pictures. I need this to be a very visual lesson. I need to show them sizes, comparisons, so they can compare and contrast the colors, the wings, the types of beaks, what beak eats what kind of seed, their claws. I need to show a lot of pictures, and it doesn't matter if they're not visual learners. I mean, of course, because that doesn't exist now we know that. But let's flip that. Okay, I'm teaching about birds, comparing and contrasting, but what if I'm comparing and contrasting the types of songs that they sing, that the birds sing? In that case, I don't really want to use a visual approach. I mean, I could show different charts with wavelengths and frequencies and things like that, amplitude, and say, imagine what this sounds like. If you can, I should have put a picture up there of sound waves, going across, and compare and contrast those visually. No, that would be ridiculous. I'm going to have clips. I'm going to play clips of different types of songs, and even if they think they're not auditory learners, I'm going to demonstrate that in an audio way. Here's an interesting example as well. So I went onto Wikipedia and grabbed, I was on the page for violin, and I grabbed this text here, this excerpt. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but a few lines. A violin generally consists of a spruce top, the soundboard, also known as the top plate, table or belly, maple ribs and back, 2 end blocks, and I mean, that's boring. I hope that you were disengaged by the second line. I don't hope that, but it's hard to read through this. You could read this for 10 minutes and maybe not get a real clear picture of what a violin even looks like. But on that same Wikipedia page, they have an image of a violin with the different portions mapped out. It's less narrative, it's less detailed, but you'll probably learn more just by studying this picture of a violin with the labels in 10 seconds than you probably would learn studying all of this narrative in 100 seconds. And that's not to say that this isn't valuable. If you're an expert on violins, and if you're at that level, then maybe it's appropriate to introduce some narrative, some text elements, and some reading. But it depends. If you're just starting out with the violin, you're going to show a violin and it doesn't matter if they're not visual learners. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, graphics, imagery, illustrations, they can be incredibly effective for certain things. So those are teaching styles. It's getting away from this concept of learning styles and refocusing it on how can I best serve the content that I'm teaching as opposed to the students. And of course, you want to always be mindful of students. So now that I've debunked this theory of learning styles and the meshing hypothesis, I'm going to focus a little bit on what are some alternatives? What does the research say? What are the good ways to learn and to teach? So I'm going to focus on some study techniques, and this could be good for us, or it could be good for the students that we teach, or even our children or friends. If you have somebody who's in school, a friend who's going back to school, this could be useful. So I have here I made this colorful. This is going to be a colorful chart representation here. These blocks here are different colors. They can represent various things. That could be, if it's a K-12 student, for example, this might be different subjects. You could have social science, math, reading, social studies, right? Social studies and science are different things. So those could be various different topics. They could be tasks. This could represent various things. But so I have, in this case, the student is studying all of the social science, social studies on Monday, a big block of time. This could be 2 hours. I don't know. It could be whatever. It could be 2 hours. It could, and then Tuesday, maybe they're studying math and they're dedicating their whole afternoon to math. And for some reason, I jump from Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday. I don't know. Maybe they take Thursday off. That's fine. You can take a day off if you want. This is a pretty common form of studying, and a lot of times you see it in college right before a final or right before an exam, and it's cramming. I'm going to study a whole lot of content all at once. And this has been shown to be incredibly ineffective. Having large blocks of time dedicated to the same thing is not an effective use of our time, and it doesn't facilitate learning very much. So an alternative is that people might say, okay, I have an afternoon. These could be 15-minute slots or half-an-hour slots. So I'm going to study math for half an hour, social studies for half an hour, economics for half an hour, and they repeat this schedule. Now this is better. It's better to vary it up a little bit, but this also isn't the most effective way to learn. A very effective way, and I wish I could have randomized these more, but I don't know, a little bit lazy. They're a little bit random. Just imagine that they're random. These are very short intervals where they rapidly bounce from one to another. I know some people are probably thinking, we want our students to have long attention span. You know, we want them to be able to dedicate an hour and sit down and just read through a topic. But the research is actually indicating that the opposite is true. It's not that we shouldn't spend time. It's just that the time that we spend, we should be bouncing, and this is incredibly not intuitive, but we should be bouncing around from one to another, not spending 1 minute, then 1 minute, but rather like 10 or 15 minutes, maybe half an hour, and then vary it up. This schedule has been shown in the research to be more effective than the second schedule, not just for studying, but there's a book called Make It Stick by Peter Brown and he talks through a few examples of these things. Very interesting read. And so he actually said outside of academia, they tried this approach with sports, with athleticism. And so they had a football team. Now, I never played football, I don't know, but so they would set up different stations. So this blue one might be like throwing, and the green one might be catching, and the red one might be tackling, and I don't know what else they do, pouring Gatorade on top of the coach's head, whatever is involved with football. They would have various stations, and they would dedicate a good amount of time to each station and then bounce around to another station. And so this was one group. We'll call this Group A. Group B, they had stations, but they would bounce around. They would say, okay, throw a few real quick. Now you're going to catch. Now you're going to tackle. Now you're going to do a lap around the thing. And they shuffled it up over and over. You know, it's very frustrating, but it kept them on their toes. And what they found is that in the first 2 weeks, Group A far outperformed Group B. Group B just seemed muddled and confused, and Group A was showing progress. They were improving. After that 2 week mark, I believe, I might have to brush up on the research, but I think it was about 2 weeks, Group B actually started to show greater improvement than Group A. And after a few weeks, then they were about equal, and by the end of the season, Group B far outperformed Group A. Group A was stuck in a rut. They improved up into and hit a plateau, but Group B was able to surpass that plateau, and in the long run, it ended up being better. Even though at the beginning, the first 2 weeks, it was very frustrating for them, but their skills, their reflexes, their speed and stamina improved. And they did this not only with football, but baseball pitches. Like, so you might throw, what are the pitch? I'm sorry, I'm not a sports person. I shouldn't be using these examples, but throw a fastball 50 times and then throw a curveball or a knuckleball and just practice. Or for golfing, a chip shot, do like 100 chip shots and then 100 drives versus another group where they would shuffle it up. Okay, let's see your fastball. Now let's see a curveball. And before they could perfect one, then they're moving on to another. And same results for the first couple of weeks. They're confused and disparaged, and after a while, by the end of the season, it ended up being very productive, and they far outperformed Group A. And we even have a question: isn't task switching bad for the brain? And it depends. If you're learning a new thing, it can be frustrating. You're not going to see growth at the beginning. But if I were to call this, let's call this top one Group A, Group B, and Group C. in the long run, Group C is far better than Group A in terms of retention, skill acquisition, and everything. So yeah, you don't want to multitask. You don't want to do things completely unstructured. But if you can unstructure variants into learning things, then it'll be better for you. And I'll mention another thing. A lot of times when people are studying, when your students are studying, they're going to go through this large block of time. They're looking for that aha moment. So they're studying this, and then right at the end they say, aha, this makes sense. Perfect. And that's actually very bad. That aha moment is bad because it's a little bit superfluous, and they feel like they've mastered the content, and it's a false sense that they've mastered it. And then they go on and learn other things, and they don't revisit this until maybe the next week on Monday, and by that time they've forgotten, and they've overcompensated. They've overcompensated their mastery of the subject. Whereas these people down here, it can be frustrating in Group C because they never get to that aha moment, not for a long time. But that's good because the next time they revisit it, they're still confused, but they have to revisit it more frequently for a shorter amount of time, and they pick up where they left off, and they try and retrace their steps. By the time they get that aha moment at the end of the semester, they will have remembered their content much more than the people up here. I mean, there are students that we have in our classes that from one semester to the other, it's as if they never took the class. It's like, didn't you guys learn this in Stats 201? It's like, well, yeah, we took the test and we forgot it because we dedicated these large blocks of time so that we could pass that test and demonstrate a competency. Whereas this other approach is more frustrating. It's harder for the brain. But if you think about that, and one of the comments here is, doesn't sound like variable interval learning. Exactly. That's the best type of learning. The harder it is for our brain, with this third schedule, it's frustrating and we make our brain work really hard, but that just strengthens the connections, the neural connections within our brain. So by the time we're finished with that course or whatever, that's pretty permanent. That's long-term memory that we're talking about because we've worked really hard, as opposed to the schedules up here is a little bit easier. Sorry, I'm just taking a break for water. There's a neuroscientist called John Medina, and I borrowed this, I recreated this graphic from a keynote that I heard him give. And he's talking about, it's not exactly variable interval learning, excuse me, but suppose this could be various things. This could be subject 1, subject 2, subject 3, subject 4, and it could be a study session where you're studying for the stats, and then you move on to behavioral economics, and then you move on to social psychology, whatever it is. But as you move on, you give yourself these booster shots. So that's where you revisit this material, and you reinforce the learning that has already taken place. And this could also be, I don't see the list here of attendees. If we have program chairs or deans or provosts, this could be the sequence of a program where, yes, there's term 1 or semester 1 or even year 1, year 2, 3, 4 if it's a doctoral student. But don't just assume that, okay, they've passed these competencies. Yes, accreditors are patting us on the back because we have good learning outcome managers. But it's beneficial to reintroduce those concepts and integrate it into other material just for the sake of having a booster shot. Just like when you're getting your immunizations, you have to have booster shots every once in a while to keep that working in your system. Now, this could also be K-12, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3. Just because they're in second grade doesn't mean they remember everything from first grade. So it's good to have those refreshers, like Sean's saying in the comments there, those booster shots. I'm going to skip this. I got excited about one of those other sections, so I'm going to skip that activity. We can do an activity here. It's just a minute. I'm going to present some alphanumeric gibberish on the screen, and I'm going to give you maybe 10 seconds to look that over and try and commit that to memory. So I'm going to do that right about now. Feel free to participate if you want, but the line's going to go silence for about 10 seconds. All right, so now I'm just going to be talking for about 10 seconds. Feel free, if you want, to get out a piece of paper and a pen and write down as many of those as you remember. So I've never actually done a poll here in GoToMeeting, but I'm going to launch this, distributing a poll. How many alphanumeric, how many letters and numbers were you able to remember off the top of your head? And go ahead and participate in the poll if you'd like. I think this will be interesting. So numbers are coming in. We had a lot of 7, 8, some 5s and 6s. Hopefully there's no 1 or 2 coming in. Or 3 or 4. I would understand if it's 3 or 4 because we're busy. I mean, this is crazy. We shouldn't have to think when we're at a webinar. So the polls came in. It looks like people remember between 5 and 9, which is interesting. Yeah, what do you think you remember? Good job, Emma, Grace. I'm in the question. People are submitting questions here. Feel free to, if you want to interact with the entire community here, you can put something in the chat window as well. Questions go to the moderators of this webinar. But generally, people remember, the rule is they remember 7 items plus or minus 2. So 5 to 9 items. I think a few of us could have remembered 10, 11, 12, perhaps. But generally, I think this distribution is what we see. 5 to 9 items, 7 plus or minus 2 is what we tend to remember. I'm going to show you now much more. That was 9 items. I'm going to show you, I think it's 15 items, and see how, these are just random off the top of my head. See how many you remember of these.
Sean, I don't think we can see the numbers. Oh, there they are. Okay, great.
Because the poll was still up. Okay. I closed the poll. You should be able to see it now. All right, so I am going to put another poll. How many letters or numbers can you remember from that one? Ideally, you should remember. Oh, I need to launch it, don't I? Okay, there's the poll. Somebody remembered all 15. A lot of people remembered all 15 or 13, 14. Tracy, you're giving them the answers there in the chat. All right. So we have about half of the people voted. And yeah, it looks like it's okay, Tracy. So a lot of people remembered all of them. That's crazy. That's way more than 7 plus or minus 2. And so why was that? Hopefully, let me see audience view. Okay, you should be able to see those again. Why are these numbers any different than the other ones? It's like, well, people are thinking you can make a story out of it. These aren't just random. I mean, I said they're random, but they have meaning. They're chunked. So FBI means something to people. 911. You can even make a story out of this. The FBI told me to call 911 because NBC wasn't displaying the Christmas special like they had to. You can tell a story and assign meaning to all of these 15 things. It would be really hard to remember these if they're truly alphanumeric, if they're random. Which you know, are there 14? Let's see. There's 6, 9, 12, 13, 14. Okay, my bad. So all you people who said that you remembered 15, you are liars because there were not 15. That was my fault. Bad poll. But you can tell a story from these. These are chunked, and so it's more meaningful. And that's how you want your content to be, especially if you're teaching things such as statistics or something that's fundamentally hard. You don't want to just teach them, okay, remember the sum square is important, and this is the form. Like, no, you want to work it into a narrative so that people remember it and they assign meaning to it. So those are some study techniques. I'm glad we got to do our fun activity there. I'm going to talk about learning theories. Now, learning theories are different than learning styles, and that learning theories are based on research, studies, empirical data presented in peer-reviewed journals, as opposed to learning styles. Learning styles are mentioned in peer-reviewed journals, but never really as primary research, or I should say as good good primary research. So I'm not going to dive too deep into any of these. I just want to mention them and encourage you to do some research on them if you haven't already. Some of these are going to be very familiar to you. Behaviorism. There's a fun cartoon. It's a cartoon of a rat, and he's holding a sign that says, "We'll pull lever for food." I couldn't find a Creative Commons image for that one, so I grabbed this one. And so this guy in his business suit, his casual Friday business suit, will pull the lever for food. Constructivism is bringing in various components and making something new, which we do individually, we do it as a class, we do it as a society, really. Cognitivism is much like the initial examples that I was given. So I'm going to give some examples of these. Behaviorism, for people not in psychology, I think a lot of people on this call are in psychology, so this will be a refresher, but it's all about increasing or decreasing a desired or a behavior. If it's desired, then we want to increase it, and if it's not desirable behavior, we want to decrease it. And how we do that is we either introduce something or we take something away. So when we're talking about positive reinforcement, if somebody's doing something well, or you want that behavior to continue, then you give some kind of reward and to encourage that behavior to continue. We do this with kids all the time. Negative reinforcement would be taking something away. The automotive industry, they want you to wear your seatbelts, and so you hop in the car, turn it on, it's going to beep at you until you put that seatbelt on. As soon as you click that seatbelt, the beeping goes away. It removes something that's unpleasant in the hopes that you're going to make it a habit to just put the seatbelt on. Punishment is not really corporal punishment, hopefully not corporal punishment. In psychology, punishment just means trying to decrease a behavior. In terms of behaviorism, we're going to try and decrease the behavior instead of increase it. And so you might introduce something. I should have written down some better examples, but I'm thinking spanking. Spanking's awful, but okay, so this kid was bad. You get a spanking so that you don't do that bad thing anymore, which is one of the great ironies of parenting. That's like, you hit your brother. Hitting is not okay. Here, let me spank you. Well, not ideal, but that's the gist of positive punishment, and it happens to be corporal, even though I said this is not necessarily corporal. Negative punishment would be taking something away for that. And interestingly, if anybody on this call works in K-12 at all, the research seems to say that young kids, so I'm thinking K through 6, they respond best to positive reinforcement. If you want to change behavior in the classroom, the best way to do that for young kids is to give them incentives for behaving well. And then when you get to adolescence, so 7th through 12th grade, they respond best to the forms of punishment, especially positive punishment. And so if the class is unruly, then you might say, okay, since you guys aren't behaving, I'm going to give you an extra thing of homework, an extra homework assignment, some busy work for you, because you guys earned that. And I want you to not behave, not be unruly in the future. So this is a lesson for you. So yeah, adolescence until they get to adulthood, then you just have to find which form works best for your students. And adult learners are different than kid learners, than child learners. Constructivism. So to demonstrate this, I have here a picture of a beach. So you might say to your class, okay, in this lesson, we're going to construct a beach. So people might bring in various pieces. So I took this image and I created a puzzle out of it to demonstrate that some people might say, okay, the teacher might lead off, what is a beach? Let's make a beach. Somebody might have a few pieces of the sky puzzle and they bring it in and say, well, you can see the sky at the beach, whether it's clouds or a cloudless day. You can see the sky. And another student might say, there's also water there, and there's a horizon line where the water meets the sky, and they're both blue. Great, that's awesome. Another student might have puzzle pieces that say there are waves at the beach as well. Another student might say there's sand at the beach, and the teacher might come and say, now in the sand, are there footprints in the sand? And another student might say with his puzzle pieces, there are footprints and sometimes you can see shells. And yet another student might say, and where the water meets the sand, there you have waves brushing up onto the shore. And so with that, with your class, you're putting all the puzzle pieces together. Some people have a concept of what a beach is, but then they get other puzzle pieces from other students or from the teacher, and they're able to change their perspective of what a beach is. Now, in reality, the beach isn't going to look like this even after your class. It's going to look something more like this. You're still going to have missing pieces here and there, but generally you can see your mind can fill in the gaps. Our brains are amazing like that, and we fill in the gaps with our own reality. So even though we paint this picture as a class, somebody might, with their different perspective, their experiences, their life, crystallized intelligence, they might fill in these pieces differently than another student or than the teacher. The teacher might have more of these pieces filled in than the students. But ultimately, that's constructivism in a nutshell. And in reality, it's not even going to look like this. Like it might look something like that, where we barely have a notion of what a beach is. There's so many gaps, but we have an idea. I think we can fill in the gaps there, and you can make your own reality. And this is life. This is the real world. And in reality, we don't know anything. The more you learn, the more you realize that we don't really know all that much. Even basic things. You've been told that 1 + 1 = 2, and that's a truth. That's a mathematical truth. But I've heard some pretty convincing arguments that 1 + 1 is actually 1.9999, which sounds silly, but they worked it out, and it's like, okay, so maybe both of them are true, or maybe neither of them are true. We have all these constants in the world, but it's really just it's like a brick wall or this puzzle piece, and with each scientific study that's published, then we fill in one more piece of puzzle and we build a new reality. And the world is different today than it was yesterday because some journal articles publish some more stuff and we have more knowledge. So that's constructivism. That's a way. It's a way to engage students. And all right, so now we're getting into cognitivism. And this is a refresher from that initial introduction, talking about our brain as a computer. We have sensory memory. We have various senses, working memory. We don't register everything that hits us. Like I don't need to think about the lawnmower, the guy mowing his lawn. I need to disregard that, but try and make the important things into a short-term memory. And with rehearsal, that's how we work things into a long-term memory. And that's cognitivism. That's the cognitivism is the approach of actually learning. It's more facts, figures, important things, data, and things. And it's a way that we can encourage that form of learning. So there are various ways that we can engage in cognitivism, such as visual aids. Visual aids are incredibly useful, and they're helpful with recall and association. I know about 20 minutes ago I showed that slide of and I debunked it, where you only remember so much of what you read and so much more of what you see. But in reality, there is research that says that if you learn with words alone, after a few days, you don't recall as much of it as if you learn the words and pair them with a visual aid of some sort. People are several days later, they're able to recall more words with images than just words alone. And so imagery is a very powerful way that we can associate things and encourage retention. Mnemonics is also very important. We've been learning mnemonics our entire life. So you might have learned the mnemonic Roy G. Biv in order to learn the colors of the rainbow, red, orange, yellow, green. Some people learn the phrase, my very excellent mother just served us nachos, in order to remember the planets. That doesn't sound like it relates, but take the first letter, my very excellent mother, Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. Some people use mnemonics for daylight saving. Let's be honest, all of us think about spring forward, fall back. Okay, it's fall time. Time is changing. Does it go forward or backwards? You think of spring forward, fall back. When I'm writing, I use a mnemonic for the word gray. I think gray spelled with an A is how you spell it in America. Gray spelled with an E is how you spell it in England. Metaphors and analogies are also incredibly important. Just like that exercise that we did, you probably still remember the FBI told me to call 911 because NBC wasn't showing the Christmas special, the DEC 25, even moments later, probably because it's something meaningful for you. So if you can make the content, frame it, and shape it through metaphors and analogies so that it's meaningful and purposeful in people's lives, then they'll remember it more. Concept mapping, I'm going to skip over that a little bit. Check out the platforms Visme or Padlet for interesting concepts or mind mapping. I'll type those here in the chat, Visme and Padlet. Those are very good platforms to engage and interact with students. And reviewing quizzes. We don't like quizzes, especially in higher education as in graduate school. There seems to almost be a stigma against quizzing, but review quizzes are incredibly effective for retention and recall. It challenges our brain, it pushes us, and it's especially good for the tip of the tongue phenomenon, which is an actual scientific term for right when you just can't quite remember something and you're working hard. Might happen all the time if you're watching a movie and it's like, what is that actor's name? It's on the tip of my tongue. And as your brain is struggling, reaching for that content, that's actually very effective. It's very good and healthy for your brain. And the next time you have that tip of the tongue moment for that very thing, it's strengthening those neural connections and helping you to remember it. And if you have, just as a side note, if you can't remember that actor's name, try and pick up any clue that you can. Do you remember the first letter of his name? Do you remember what other movie he was in? Do you remember the plot of the movie? What was the co-star? Bring up all this information and try and tie it in because so much of our memory is associated with other things. And so you can, through paired association, you can remember concepts that might seem disparate, but they're really not. So just a tip there. Let me get back on the screen here. Oops. I don't know what's going on there. A few honorable mentions. I won't really talk much about them. Humanistic, not psychology, humanistic learning theory, I think is really great. I suggest looking into that. Neuroscience, neuroscience as a learning theory is also pretty awesome. And especially look at declarative versus non-declarative memory, how it's stored in the hippocampus. If you've ever been in a shop and you smelled a scented candle that smells kind of like nutmeg and cinnamon, and all of a sudden you're remembering being at your grandma's house when you were a child, even though it's July and you're in a different state, and that's your neuroscience. That's the paired association, and you're all of a sudden you're remembering people, you're remembering dates. This was Christmas time, and you're remembering feelings. It's a lot of declarative and non-declarative memory that are paired together and they're stored together in the hippocampus and other places and bringing it out. So that's a very, very fun thing to study. Andragogy here is, it's like pedagogy. Andragogy deals with adult learners, and adult learners are different than child learners because they're highly motivated. They typically, or at least the students that you have, I hope, they are learning because they want to learn. And they're more independent, they're responsible for their own lives. They tend to take mistakes more personally, and it can affect their self-esteem as well. But they also bring to the table a lot of diversity in terms of experiences, education, their backgrounds. Think constructivist learning theory. And adult learners actually learn at a much slower pace, but they have an equal capacity for learning. And remember that all you people who are intimidated by things like coding or design or something, like I can never pick that up. I'm too old. I'm too stuck in my ways. Adult learners can learn. Sometimes they just take a little bit longer. But if you have the conviction and the motivation, then you can be just as effective as a very young person who is also learning to code. And in fact, just yesterday, one of my students was saying, she was a little disparaged, and she was saying, I have to learn, I'm trying to learn coding, but I pick up these little kid books like for really young kids, and I teach myself that way. And it's like, that's fantastic. That's how little kids are learning, and so that's how you can learn. It's like, we can do that. Adults are more, they have a lot of experience, and they're very problem-solving oriented, so leverage that. And touch on the community of inquiry. We've actually given entire presentations about this topic. The community of inquiry outlines a classroom that for an ideal learning experience, which is this intersection of all these things here, the teacher has to be prepared and willing to facilitate a lesson. Students need to interact amongst themselves. You have to have content, which usually comes in the form of PowerPoint slides or a textbook or journal articles. But then you also have interactions. Students need to read the textbook. They need to associate with the content. They need to interact with the teacher. The teacher needs to know the content and prepare a lesson. And when all of that takes place, when there's good interaction between all of those, then that's the ideal educational setting. Now, sometimes, and there's a lot of research behind community of inquiry, I suggest looking that up and exploring that. I have some examples of ineffective situations. So this would be an unstructured classroom where there's a teacher, there's a social aspect, students, a lot of interaction between them, and that's great, but there's no content. And so, that's like a study hall. That's just, it's just, a chat session, and it might be engaging and interesting, but it's not structured, which is not what we want for in higher education or any education. There's also the lecture where, yes, there's content. Yes, there are students, the social aspect, but the teacher monopolizes the time. And so this Mickey Mouse scenario, then it might be a lecturer or a teacher who goes off on tangents, but there isn't that interaction. Students need to interact with each other, with the teacher, and with the content in order for the classroom to be effective. Here's the teacher who just dials it in. Yes, the teacher is present and there's some social aspect, but mostly it's, okay, go read the textbook and go take a quiz. And they don't really interact and it's not engaging. And that's not much more different than telling the student, okay, go to the library and look it up. And after the semester's over, then you will have passed the course. Just go interact with the content. Not great. There's also a novice teacher where the students monopolize the time. There's content there, but the teacher, probably not as frequent. I think that we're pretty experienced teachers at our institutions, but we have to be mindful of that the teacher does need to have a presence. The teacher needs to be an expert, subject matter expert on the content, and they need to facilitate the discussions. So ideally, we're looking at that nice interaction. The teacher can't monopolize everything. Students sometimes need to be wrangled in, and the content needs to be good and present in the course. So with that, I believe that's the extent of what I want to share with you. I wanted to give a plug to ourselves. This recording is going to be on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/tcsedtech. You can also see our blogs at tcsedtech.com. And so I hope to see you there, and let me know if you have questions or comments about any of this stuff. Here's some content. I forgot to put my email up there, but my email, snufer@tcsedsystem.edu. And I want to thank everybody for attending and for bearing with me, and I hope that you learned something, and I hope that this is a discussion that we can continue.